All right, so this is going to be our last day of content, new content in here, I think. I think we're going to get to that point, which is very nice. So starting next week, we're going to be playtesting balanced harmony decks in here. So if you would like to start gathering data as early as possible, so you have as much data as possible so that you can make real claims about your design decisions on your paper in a way that, as there is more data, I have a harder time arguing with your claim. If you say, this deck feels completely balanced, out of 4 games, they each won 2, then I'm going to really look at and say, I think this is a small sample size mirage because something else on the side. Whereas if you say, I had 20 games with each of these decks, then it's a lot harder for me to poke a hole in that. I have to take your results more seriously. And I can't just say, looking at your design decisions, I don't agree. I don't think that this would play out in practice. So the more data you have, the more your results will carry weight in terms of your arguments. Questions before we dive back into combat? I did release the study guide yesterday as well, so that's out in preparation for our last exam in here a week from today. And that, the harmony paper, all that's left. You can tell by all of the empty seats. This is a very popular lecture style, I can tell. Last time we were talking about different things to consider with regards to combat. We talked about progression, and I think we had not quite gotten into volume. I think we're in the middle of this slide. So talking about combat, in terms of volume, we can look at the first thing to consider is how much is combat the focus of the game? To what extent does the player opt into combat? So how much combat is there in your game? How frequently should the player be engaged in that combat as a proportion of the overall game? If it is a narrative-driven game, then there should be some combat, but you shouldn't be in combat so frequently that the story is so infrequent and it feels like you're slogging along to get to the next story interaction. You should have a bit more balance. If it's an action-oriented game, then a story takes a back seat and you want to throw your player into combat as quickly as possible and as frequently as possible. But you can also look at when the player has a choice between engaging with an enemy and running away, or using stealth and hiding. How frequently do they opt into that combat? And that can give you some clues or some hints into how engaging is your combat system, how balanced are things. If your player doesn't feel like they need to get stronger, maybe you're not rewarding enough from your combat. Maybe the player is feeling strong enough to handle the next big challenge, and so they're opting out of the combat. If you're expecting the combat to play a larger role than it is in practice, then that's something that you can iterate on and design around. Let's look at some constraints. So what can get in the way? The length of the game is the first thing that you should really consider with regards to how much freedom you have in your design. If you're targeting a game that is very short, like a 10-hour game, how many weapons and enemy types should you create as the player goes through that 10-hour process? How many weapons and enemies are you expecting the player to learn and master per hour? Don't throw too much at the player all at once. If you're trying to spread it out over a longer game, work on and think about how are you training your player to engage with that mechanic, with combat. What is an easier thing for the player to do? What is a more difficult thing for the player to do? What eventually do you want your player to have mastered at the halfway point, at the quarter point of your game? And that can help you to figure out what types of enemies to put earlier on, what types of enemies to put later on, what types of enemies to wait to introduce for the first time until the player has demonstrated a bit more mastery of the game's mechanics. And yeah, all content takes time to make and to balance. How much repetition do you want in your game? So we'll talk about that as another one. But if you have a lot of repetition in a 10-hour game, that's probably not a great idea. But Is repetition of existing content a good way of bloating your game out from 10 hours to 20 hours or 20 hours to 40 hours? That depends. How long does a typical combat take? Average player versus the average enemy, how much real world time, how many hits to defeat an average encounter of multiple enemies, how long is that going to take? You can get an idea in level design if you're targeting about a 10-hour game, how many encounters should you place and where in order to get the player to take a certain amount of time to go from point A to point B. What is in the way? How long will it take for the player to get rid of what's in the way? Does length of combat change over time? When the game is easier in its early levels, is the combat faster? Is the combat slower because the player isn't powerful enough yet? There are some games where the tutorial enemies can be killed in 1 or 2 hits, and then the later enemies are killed in 10 hits. And on the other hand, you might have a game where the player feels weak early on, so it takes many hits to kill something, and you show the player progression through the fact that they can 1 or 2 hit enemies at the end of the game. So very different types of design, but it affects things like the rest of these design decisions around combat. How frequent is the combat? Yeah, how much of the overall game should be spent in combat? We already talked about that a bit. Should it be evenly distributed or change frequency as the game evolves? So maybe as the player is learning combat, you space it a little bit more further out. That also allows you to set the stage for your narrative and have more narrative scenes. And by the time the player has shown and learned and demonstrated mastery, then they can more frequently engage with the mechanic that they have mastered. On the other hand, if your combat is relatively simple, maybe you want to throw the player a lot of that combat early on and then taper that off toward the end of the game, giving them many other ways to engage with the game. Maybe there are mini games that they can do where a lot of that is not combat. And now the player is only going back to combat every once in a while as they explore new ways to play the game. You can also look at the number of combatants. So how does that change as the game progresses? Is it always a 1v1 type of fight? Are you expanding this to 1v2, 1v3, 3v3? How does the combat evolve as you add allies, as you add enemies? How does that change the game? Are there engine limitations? This can be with regards to the number of particles on the screen at a time. It's worth also thinking about the wear and tear on your user's CPU and GPU. What kind of hardware are you trying to support? Are you trying to restrict this to those who have significant gaming rigs? Are you trying to make this an accessible game that everyone can play? How many particles, how many calculations you design for will certainly affect that. Player cognition limitations. Do you want this to be an accessible game to someone who's had a very long, hard day at work, has been working long, hard days for the last week, has kids, is 5, all sorts of possibilities there. And then also budget limitations, just how much money do you have? How much time do you have to develop? Can you rope other people in order to make the game the scale that you would want it to be? So budget limitations could make you have to scale back things like the scope of your plans in terms of what the game's combat looks like. We've all played games that don't have enough variety to their combat. Feels like you're doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. Sometimes that's a good thing. Players like that, and sometimes players want to change it up. So most players do get bored doing the same thing repetitively. There needs to be the next achievement for them, the next thing they're planning for, the next thing they're trying to do. So you can add visual variety to your combat. Enemies who looked at act distinct, meaning that there are different player patterns that are required to defeat those enemies. Make some small, fast, nimble enemies. Make some large, hard-hitting, slow enemies. Make some that have significant range to their attacks. Some that do not and require you to be up close and personal. Some that are heavily armored. Some that are open and exposed from a distance. This will completely change how the player wants to approach that combat. Use the concept of size to your advantage. So if you make an enemy that is large, the player may assume that it will take them longer to defeat, which is perfectly okay. It's important to, when you do have combat, enemy attacks should be telegraphed in some way that the player knows what to expect. Any good game, the player should be able to use their visual acuity to determine what's going to happen, not just what is happening, with enough time to be able to react to it. The visuals of the enemy design can tell you a lot about the path that you should take to defeat it. You don't need to do something like tag an enemy with armored if you can visually show that they are wearing armor and that that armor has an effect on the game. So aim to use fewer words and descriptions where you can and turn that into something that is visually accessible and it adds to the immersion factor of the game. If it has a larger weapon, then a player will approach an enemy differently than if it has a smaller weapon. If you make enemies that look similar, behave similar, then players can learn movement patterns or attack patterns of those kinds of enemies. And if you change around the stats a little bit, the player still knows something that I have tried in the past that has been successful will likely be successful again when I try it against this enemy that is similar. So they can use their existing knowledge, but then they have to adapt to those differences between enemy to enemy. But like in machine learning with the concept of transfer learning, you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from some prior experience on something that was similar, not starting from scratch. How do you change things up within levels? So consider statistical differences between enemies, damage and HP of enemies within a level. You can do this with proportion to something visual, but you don't necessarily have to. Make an enemy feel tanky, make an enemy feel like a glass cannon. In the same way that the player character can build their character in different ways to play differently, you can design enemies that play differently and require different tactics in order to defeat. So thinking about what combinations of enemies could the player face? If you design a bunch of different enemies and then allow them to appear in combinations, what certain combinations create a multiplicative difficulty for the player? So given what you anticipate the player's power is at this level, at this stage of their skill development and character development, what are the worst combinations of enemy types that a player could face? If the player can only have a single target ability and they face 5 glass cannon enemies at a time, and this is a turn-based game, that is especially dangerous. They can one-shot one of the glass cannon enemies on their first turn, but then 4 enemies get to attack them with very powerful attacks because glass cannon. Does the player have enough hit points between when they act once and when they act again in the worst combination of enemies in terms of how much damage they could receive? That's something that you should certainly take into account before you allow any combination of 5 enemies to appear in an encounter.
I feel like a pretty quintessential trope with the RPGs is a big tanky dude surrounded by a bunch of creatures that run up into you and explode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need escape patterns, or you need caps on the number of enemies that can spawn at a time that can explode to make sure that regardless of if they're attempting to surround, if they spawn in such a way that they surround the player, there's still there's a guaranteed area or a gap that the player can escape from. That's the kind of physics calculation that you want to make when you're designing what can spawn and where and how. It's tempting to just shortcut that and design something that doesn't take a ton of thought. But again, think about that worst case scenario because that will be what players attach themselves to. There's some player out there who their very first encounter is that worst combination of enemy types. And that player has quit the game now because you made it possible for them to experience that. There's certainly a trade-off between consistency and predictability and variance. So how predictable are the enemy encounters? How predictable is your combat? And then how much variance do you allow for? So if there's only one enemy type and you can only encounter one or two of them, there's a ton of consistency and predictability. When you're in an encounter, you know how to prepare for that encounter. If you have 10 different enemy types and you allow any combination of up to 5 enemies to show up together, there's no predictability. There's a ton of variance in these encounter types, and the player needs to be prepared for the worst at all times. Otherwise, they may die. They may lose progress. Enemy behaviors. Enemy skills should be varied in nature, not just the enemy types, but the actual skills that they use. So have some enemies have single target abilities, area abilities, require you to dodge out of the way of an area of attack. Something that forces the player to evaluate encounters and plan how they're going to defeat that encounter. You could have enemies with close range attacks and ranged attacks. Have them appear in pairs where one of the characters is trying to walk up and melee you that you have to defend and block, and another one is going to try to pelt you with ranged attacks during that process. That's especially interesting if now those ranged attacks can hit the melee character from behind that is also fighting you. You can, at the same time that you're trying to fight and parry the melee character, try to place the melee character between you and the ranged character in a way that now there are two characters attacking the character that's in the way between you and the ranged character. That creates a very interesting dynamic between them. You can design for enemy AI that makes tactical sense. That just gives the player a sense of this isn't just a sponge in the way between me and a level up. It's something that's actively trying to kill me. So ranged enemies shouldn't bum rush you. That doesn't make sense. Why would they do that? They should hang back. The tanks should rush forwards and try to tank for the ranged characters. It feels like the enemies are using tactics to try to defeat you, and that makes you feel as the player even better when you defeat the AI, when the AI is acting intelligently, or what is perceived as intelligently. Again, it should always be designed to be defeated. That is the purpose of an enemy AI, but you want to make your player feel smart when they do it. It shouldn't just be, it was a bunch of ranged characters. They walked up to me and tried to fire their bow at me at point blank. Have different AI behaviors for single enemies and enemies in groups. They should act differently when in different situations. If they have a bunch of allies, they should be more aggressive, feeling like they have a chance. If they're acting by themselves, maybe they're a little bit more, they try to run around a corner and attack you from behind a corner. It makes more sense if the enemy is trying to preserve itself. Add stages to boss encounters. Things that target different skill sets at different pieces. A boss should feel difficult to defeat and not like a single strategy defeated that boss. Maybe the boss is changing strategy, therefore you need to change strategy as a result. That doesn't mean that the boss needs to transform or get bigger or get harder or stronger, but have the boss do something like walk up to you with a sword and a shield, and at some point you break the shield. And now the boss changes its attack pattern because it no longer has a shield and is now capable of swinging its sword faster with two hands that are on that sword. It makes you change up how you're engaging with that boss. It's staged, but not really staged in terms of you're fighting someone different. So changes the difficulty of the encounter and the strategy that you need in the middle of the encounter, which feels very, that's how you make an encounter feel very mano a mano, very me versus them, and not just, again, a sponge in the way of you. Vary the locations the battles take place in. So this should be more than just visual, but look at amounts and type of cover, how narrow or open the arena or the area is, how many obstacles are there in the way. So mechanics based on location. So a hydration mechanic when you're in a desert, how your movement changes when you're on ice. No one ever wants to protect a vulnerable NPC, but you can design it anyway. Protect a convoy. No one ever likes that one either. But you can design alternate battle mechanics, and especially if your character is allowed to feel overpowered, or you design something for your character to feel overpowered, you need to add something that is a potential failure point. And if there is something else in the game world that is an additional objective other than just your character stays alive, that's a way of adding variety to your combat. Yeah.
I think a really good example of this is not that I'm too into like the hack and slash games, but like the Devil May Cry series or the
Yeah.
Bayonetta series, where yeah, the gameplay, yeah, you have the varying enemies, the gameplay is the same, but the game incentivizes you to keep changing parts of the moveset that you do, so you can keep getting combo counter going up. Because the
Yeah.
second you keep spamming the same thing over and over again, the combo counter is like, dude, this isn't flashy enough. What are you doing? So even though you could do the repetitive thing the entire way through the game's going to complain about the fact that you're just being lame. Yeah.
I you should totally be a hybrid here between something like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and Devil May Cry. It's like what are you doing with your your skate sword? It's just not flashy enough.
To mix it up, man. You did the
Yeah.
same thing like 4 times ago. This is a C rank, man. At least be cool.
Yeah.
Sign.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So any behaviors you add have to be remembered by the player. So keep behaviors to some number of learnable types per enemy. Don't give one enemy 10, 12, 15 different attack patterns because the player will need to remember them all and have a counterplay for all of them. Keep in mind the memory limitations of most humans. And yeah, the player needs to know everything that is possible in order to act intelligently. So just keeping that in mind, that again, you're designing this to be defeated, but to be challenging. So you want to add variety, but not so much variety that you overwhelm the player. It's a nice middle ground there somewhere. What kinds of counterplays exist? So how should the player be responding to danger? You don't want to just, the answer to all danger is a dodge roll. There have certainly been those kinds of games, but vary up how the player responds to danger. So are there offensive and defensive viable options available? For things like grid-based combat, does the player have the ability to make up for mistakes, being able to restore health and status effects? Do they have the ability to do that? If that is the case, then you can add enemies that do those effects, have those effects, actually deal damage in a way that forces the player to strategize their counterplays around the enemy attacks. Does the map have cover? Can the player move to cover effectively? Can the player gain information about the enemy before the enemy is aware of them in an attempt to strategize how they're going to approach the enemy and not have to make that reactive, make the player act proactively rather than reactively? A lot of people think counterplays are just reactive, but counterplays can be proactive in that I know that this enemy now deals this status effect, so I can place the unit that is capable of healing that status effect in an appropriate location to now the counterplay is set up and strategized in a way that you have prepared for success. Does the player have options to deal damage at various ranges? This means that how they set up their units in this grid-based combat is relevant. How can they maximize their damage output? That's a separate, interesting question now. Are the enemy's movement and attack patterns predictable? All of these lead to better strategic decisions by your player and allow you to increase the difficulty to compensate. We expect the player to be utilizing this level of strategy. Therefore, the appropriate level of difficulty, the difficulty ceiling can be raised. Whereas if the player does not have the ability to do this, you cannot raise the difficulty as much. And there's very little difference between the average player and the intelligent player or the strategizing player. Maybe that's beneficial to your game, but if you're designing it to be a strategic game, then you should raise the ceiling of the strategies required to defeat the enemies. Continuous movement combat. Does the player have the information that they need to figure out how to improve on their results? How good is the telegraphing? Does the player have enough time to react? Or do they have so much time to react that it's a problem. Huge pet peeve of mine. If I see an enemy starting an attack animation and I know exactly where it's going to land, and I dodge roll out of the way, but I do it soon enough that the enemy can turn and then attack me as I'm coming up from that dodge roll. I successfully executed the counterplay, but I did it too soon. I recognized it too quickly. And I don't like the idea of having to time the dodge roll because the enemy can adapt to the dodge. That's not what a dodge does. The dodge gets you out of the way of danger, not puts you in danger in a way you can't recover from. That's silly. I'm sorry. My brain works quickly. Don't design your game to punish me for that. That feels bad from a player's perspective. Can the player block or evade? And again, multiplicative effect on design space between enemy types and weapon types. So if there are 10 enemies and each of those enemies can equip a different weapon, now there are 100 different weapon enemy combinations that you need to be prepared for. And the same goes, I guess, for player weapon types as well. So if there are 10 enemy types and 10 player weapon types, now the strategy that you use to defeat each enemy type may be based on the weapon type that you have as well. So that's all information the player needs to be aware of if they're cycling between the different kinds of player weapons, which is preferable in most games because you don't want to pick one type of weapon and then just use that for the whole game. That's a little on the boring side. We talked about the time between encounters. So what uses do out of combat time have in a game? First one is anticipation. If it is a combat driven game, the time out of combat builds anticipation toward the next instance of that combat. You can't wait to get back into the combat, especially if we're building up toward an important fight, a fight that will reward you especially. There's also recovery. So a break in tension of some kind, especially narratively, after the previous combat. You just don't want to go, you don't want to go from combat to combat to combat to combat. You want to space those out, and each combat will have more weight if there is anticipation and recovery from the intensity of combat. I mean, if combat is so second nature that you can just press buttons or press keys and not even look at the screen, then there's no real strategy or value from your combat. So you're not going to build a ton of anticipation. You don't need recovery from this. But if you're requesting your player to spend a lot of their mental acuity on that combat, they're going to get drained if they're consistently on edge in that combat. So the more you're doing that, the better this will play, both the anticipation and the recovery. It's more important to space that combat out a bit. So we do need that empty space for tension and anticipation. What do you want to fill that empty space with? Doesn't need to be empty, it just means devoid of combat. So horror games are good at creating these kinds of situations. Something could happen, it builds tension for something that does not happen. But that empty space can be filled with narrative, it could be filled with exploration, it could be filled with what else? Character development, mini games,
Trading.
upgrades, trading, yep. Resource management. So yeah, just making sure that your combat is spaced with something else that is interesting. So yeah, good place for story-driven mechanics. Player finds an audio log, listens to it while they walk down a hallway or explore around an area. And you can, at the same time, overlap some narrative background with the player actively doing something. Make sure that the audio can finish playing before the player is distracted by something. So don't put something like an audio log right by an encounter or an audio log right by an NPC that's going to interrupt the audio log to tell you something useless.
Too much of that crap in games.
Yeah,
Too much.
yeah. Make sure that if you put something in the game that it's meant to be listened to, that it's meant to be interacted with and engaged with. It helps flesh out the world of the game. It's not just there to be there. So intelligent design for audio logs, having that introduce characters, foreshadow some kind of fight that you're actually going to engage with, expand on the world lore. Again, make it relevant and interesting to the player. You can absolutely do that. As you design the game, you should be figuring out at every level, at every design space, what is the expected player power? What is the deviation? So think of this as like the standard deviation of expected player power. So what is the average player power and how much can that deviate based on choices that are made in the areas leading up to this area? Keep track of the enemy power. So as part of the player power, how many hits or how much time does it take for the average player to defeat the average enemy in that area? How many hits or how much time does it take the average enemy to defeat the player? If you store information like this, balance issues tend to just reveal themselves. If it takes you more hits to kill an enemy than it takes the enemy to kill you, and you don't deal enough damage yet, then the balance issue is apparent. It's worth talking about balance issues that can arise when games support both melee and ranged. Any examples of this? Any games offhand that have a very bad balance between melee and ranged? One and two?
Just Minecraft in general.
Minecraft?
With reason to use range.
Yeah.
Witcher 3.
Witcher?
Yeah, the range is completely useless stuff, but
Interesting. So range is useless, range is useless.
There's something kind of this has been patched, but I'm just thinking like TF2 where you're allowed a melee up, you're allowed to attack with a melee weapon, but and there was a period where it really wasn't useful to run up and swing your opponents with a melee, so they had to buff it so that there's a chance to give more critical hits than losing them.
I know in Helldivers, like the entire game is built around like just like range, like shooting, of course. And then fans were like, "Yo, we want melee weapons." So then the devs added melee weapons, and of course they were kind of bad because the game wasn't intended to be built around them. So they kept having to buff them and then adding other things so they can actually be useful. And now they're kind of okay, but it's a very different thing.
Path of Exile is full of one-shot mechanics. So ranged is good because being in melee range means you are dead. So skills have acquired the melee tag for things like you slam your weapon on the ground and it creates ranged projectiles. That's a melee attack. Melee.
Yeah, it's very the same thing where like after some point in the game, it's a melee weapon, but it has more range than most other weapons in the game. It's giant beam.
Yeah. So depending on the game, there's some big tension between the concept of trying to balance for characters that want to be up close and personal, they're in more danger, and characters that want to stay back and engage from afar. So melee characters are expected to be tankier, but take more hits. So a design question for the game that you're making, can a melee character escape an encounter? Do they have the ability? Or once they're engaged in an encounter, do they have to defeat that encounter before moving on? Games that don't allow melee characters to escape, they should be tankier as a result. That allows the player to prepare for the encounter and have more tools at their disposal to engage with that encounter. And players will want that feeling of, I could tank this, but to do that, maybe you don't want to give them the ability to escape. That is one of the downsides. Ranged characters need cover or fast movement, and they should be focused on evading damage rather than taking hits. So if they can attack fast, they are nimble, they are mobile, then attacks are more lethal to them than they are to a melee character. But should a ranged character be able to, with a skilled person playing, kite any enemy to avoid taking any damage whatsoever, where kiting is the idea of you move, attack, move, attack, move, attack. Usually you're going farther away from the enemy. If you are faster than them, you can get space between you and the enemy, turn around, fire on the enemy as they're getting closer to you, turn around, get farther away from the enemy, turn around, fire on them. And as the enemy is moving at a linear pace toward you, you are capable of using your excess speed to get attacks of opportunity on them in ways that they can't respond to. So there's no easy known solution to that problem if you want a ranged character to be fast enough, aside from giving your enemies ranged attacks or attacks that predict where your character is going to be. If an enemy sets up for a ranged attack and your character is fast, are they firing at where you are right now, which is good design in general, forcing the player to continue to move. They feel like they're evading the attacks. If they use predictive movement, then between when the AI makes the decision to fire and when it hits that location, the player will have needed to move. And that's difficult if your attack takes long enough to fire up and hit. So range combat tends to either feel really good if your character is fast enough and the AI is dumb enough, or really bad if you don't have the ability to still dodge attacks and you're taking hits, as many hits as a melee character would take from a ranged attack. So that's just something that you have to try to balance for and consider with regards to the play styles that you want to support in your game. How do you balance players who want to be up close and personal and characters who want to feel like they're evading and attacking from afar rather than being up close and personal? Players will attempt degenerate strategies in your game. That is something that you should expect. Players want to exploit the game's systems. So a degenerate strategy is just a combat loop that is effective in every situation against everything. So players will go to this. They will find an optimal solution and select it over what is a fun solution or an engaging solution. So if you design in a way that players can exploit, players won't choose to explore the game's systems. You may have designed 5, 6, 7 more cool skills and systems, and if it's not part of this degenerate strategy, players won't be playing around with it. They won't be experiencing the content that you designed for your own game. So you can remove the degenerate strategy. Just remove it from the game or nerf it in some capacity. If players saying they're having fun with it, you'll possibly suffer retention issues as players get bored doing the same thing over and over again. So if you remove it, then players will be more likely to engage with more of the systems and you'll have more longevity. You could make the degenerate strategy a core component of the game's creative direction. Basically saying, yeah, there were these other things, but now they're going to be supportive systems to this main system. The degenerate strategy is now our main point of development effort. We're going to turn this degenerate strategy into a balanced strategy. Everyone's still using it. They've been trained to use it, but now that strategy is going to start challenging them with the new content that we make and the balancing that we make on the existing game systems. That way players don't feel like you're telling them how to play the game. It feels like they discovered the system and now the game is adapting to their choices. And that generally gets better reception. So vary the ways that players can create or interact with the strategy and focus future content around that strategy. And players feel rewarded for having discovered it. Games, of course, should provide challenge consistently, but players also need the motivation to play. So a game should seem winnable to both beginners and experts. That makes sense, but maybe not truly be winnable. Pac-Man is an example of this that looks very winnable, but the actual strategy needed to defeat it is incredible. It's a challenge even for algorithms to defeat Pac-Man. So how to design for something that looks winnable, that has a significant challenge to it. So where are your failure points? Where are players going to fail in your game? Players should feel like it was their fault when they failed, not the game's fault. So this is another question you can ask during playtesting. When a player dies, to what extent do they blame their own lack of skill or their own decision making? And to what extent do they blame that stupid game? To what extent do they blame the controls? To what extent do they blame their own correctable errors? So this tells you a lot of how forward-facing the game is. It can lead to some design changes for yourself and for the game, but it also may help you to design around having players actually recognize the mistakes that they make. How transparent is your game when a player does not succeed. So, yeah, of course, if players blame the game or the controls, they get frustrated. They quit the game. If they blame themselves, then there's motivation there to improve. They see what they need to do to improve. They have a path to that improvement. And if you blame the game or the controls, that's not something that can improve. So you should design around players recognizing their own failures and being aware of their own failures. So incredibly important to gain this during playtesting. My last example of this, and you can call me a crotchety old man if you'd like at this point, but I installed Neo for the first time. And in the very tutorial encounter, I hated how that felt so much that I immediately Alt F4'd and uninstalled the game. It took me all of maybe 30 seconds to a minute to just nope out of the game.
The new one?
Just the very first one.
Oh, okay. The new one's supposed to be like ridiculous, like not fun at all.
Yeah.
Neo, like how's that spelled?
NIOH.
Oh, that.
Oh,
Neo.
oh, I heard that game. It's,
Yeah. Yeah. It's supposedly very good. And I just did not feel like I was going to have the patience to master the game systems.
Do you like Ninja Gaiden?
I didn't play it enough to. Yeah, games that are meant to be difficult from the beginning and feel like you're. I don't have the patience for that anymore. I don't have the time investment for a skill-based system. If it's a numerical system, for some reason, I'm much more engaged with it. But as soon as it's a skill-based system that feels clunky or feels like it's not responding to what I want my character to be doing, there's a level of precision that I don't have as a player, and I recognize it, but I also lack the motivation to learn it. Because I know it's going to be work. And the developers put a ton of effort into that game, and it works for a particular niche that I guess I'm not a part of, but just seeing all of the work they put into that, that's your tutorial. I Alt F4'd in the tutorial. That's bad. I don't know. I think I would like the game if it had a more gentle introduction to. So just be aware that even if you're trying to target a specific demographic, even a Soulsborne type of demographic, that people need a gentle introduction to the game's mechanics. They might not have played every Soulsborne ever before that game. Don't force them into something that is going to make it feel like they have a lot to learn right from the beginning.
FromSoft games are masterpieces, and I'll never enjoy one.
Yeah.
And for the really insecure people who like always think it's their fault, they're like, it can't possibly be because this game's actually too hard.
So that's the end of content for the class. This is everything that I have designed. Any questions or thoughts on combat or tying any of these ideas to games that you've played or to experiences that you've had? Either in a good way or a bad way, or how you want to consider this for maybe designing your first game. What would you prioritize?
You were talking about how ranged could be balanced. I thought of the like Shadow Mordor, Shadow of War game. You could move in and out of range and melee like so fast that it feels like it's not really separate systems.
Yeah.
Really cool.
Those games are amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're so good.
The combat feels really good in them too. You feel
You can level
powerful.
someone, you can be like, I want to shoot an arrow, or I just want to teleport to it and start attacking. It's so cool.
Yeah, you feel so strong. And then narratively it makes sense too.
Yeah.
It's not just you have the ability to do this. It's set up to the point where you understand where you are, why you're doing what you're doing, why you have the abilities that you do.
The progression's so good. Like you start out, it's pretty hard, and then by the end, you're just a monster.
Yeah. It's worth taking inspiration from both the exact ideas in a system like that, but also as you start having future experiences with games, try to think about it from a design perspective. Like, what design decisions went into this to create this feeling that I have, this effect? And try to, if you're eventually going to make a game for retail, think about how you can create similar kinds of experiences for people from the other direction, the other perspective, from that design perspective. How did they create a system like that? How do you start with nothing and come up with that idea?
I like games where like the combat feels like puzzles.
Yeah,
I'm just like wondering how that falls into all of this because you like the puzzle can't be too hard and there has to be tension
right.
and there has to be a risk of failure. Like Shadow of the Colossus. Right. Because you never feel like you never feel like you can't do it, but it feels so insurmountable at first. Like when anyone first plays that game, they see the first guy and it's like, yeah, that's how am I supposed to beat that guy?
Yeah,
And then eventually you figure it out, you know.
I see the action tower defense genre as something that's very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots to consider. Other thoughts with the last few minutes of class? All right, I think we will leave it there.